The first key point, which is also a caveat, is that context matters. So generations don't exist in isolation. We can't talk about generations without really considering the world that they live in and the reality that they navigate, whether it is technological shifts or economic conditions or societal norms. The second big thing that I would also point out is that we need to be a little cautious about labeling because some differences are simply age related. They may not be generational. So think about, for instance, something that you or me would have done maybe 15 years ago might not have been labeled as millennial behavior back then, but today we might mistakenly attribute similar behaviors to Gen Z. If you're not careful, generational labels can also oversimplify complex human experiences or even reinforce stereotypes.
Thanks so much for joining today. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Same here. Very excited, Vince, to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been really great to just get to know you. You're an incredibly intellectually curious, experienced L&D professional with a lot of thinking and research that you do on your own. And so I'm really excited to dive in, I guess, today on the topic of intergenerational impact on workplaces. So why don't we just dive right in? I want to maybe first start with the book you wrote, The Millennials, on the topic of intergenerational dynamics. What would you say are some top insights from that book that have proven to be most accurate in the workplace?
So, Vince, I would like to start by giving you a little bit of context about, how I wrote the book and what's the background to it. So, the book itself came out, I think it's been close to a decade now. That's when millennials were at the stage where Gen Z is today. So they were entering the workforce, they were becoming first-time managers, launching startups and what have you. So this was before the current AI wave that we are in right now. So this was much before all of that. And the world at that point in time looked very different, right, from what it is today. So to your, so directly jumping into your question, which is, what are some of those dynamics from the book that kind of stood out and still are relevant today? I would say the first key point, which is also a caveat, is that context matters. So generations don't exist in isolation. We can't talk about generations without really considering the world that they live in and the reality that they navigate in, whether it is technological shifts or economic conditions or societal norms. So there's a professor, John Twenge of San Diego University, who's done a lot of research on generations. And she's pointed out that these external factors play a considerable role in shaping behaviors and attitudes just as much as age or generational identity. So that's one part of it, which kind of has stayed back with me. And it's true even today when we talk about Gen Z and Gen Alpha and what have you. The second big thing that I would also kind of point out, which is following the first, is that we need to be a little cautious about labeling, right? Because some differences are simply age related. They may not be generational. We know that a typical generation spans for about 15 to 18 years, which means that Gen Z right now is firmly in the workplace where millennials have grown older. So you and me, we've grown older while Gen Z is coming in now. So when younger employees seem to think or act differently from their older colleagues, we often assume that it's a generational trait. But many cases, it's not. These differences are simply a function of life stage. So because a person is young, he or she may choose to take certain career-related decisions, for instance, which has not always doesn't have anything to do with the generation. So that's one. So think about, for instance, something that you or me would have done maybe 15 years ago might not have been labeled as millennial behavior back then, but today we might mistakenly attribute similar behaviors to Gen Z. Right. So those, I think, if you're not careful, generational labels can also oversimplify complex human experiences or even reinforce stereotypes. So I think these are the two, overarching themes that remain even today, irrespective of the fact that the world that has changed. And the third big piece is something that I did as research for the book. So when I was researching the book, I, of course, went into a lot of books and articles and research studies and what have you. And I came across this very interesting book. It's quite old, actually. It's called Geeks and Geezers by the gentleman called Warren Bennis. He, in his book, talks about the significance of era. And this goes to my first point about the importance of context. So he says that in an analog world, which used to be pre-digital era before our time, things were linear. There were maps and you could go a certain direction. Organizations were defined as mechanical systems. But today the world has changed. There is a lot of non-linearity in the way that the world moves, the way that we make decisions. We don't have maps anymore. We have compasses. We have general directions in which we move. I'm sure as a startup founder, you also pivot when required, right? So organizations today are more akin to living systems than purely mechanical beings. There's a lot more fluidity in work cultures, for instance, a lot more flexibility. The way that leadership is evolving is also transformed. So it used to be command and control, order, predict, but now it's a lot more about alignment, empowerment, creation, right? So leadership in itself is also evolving as a construct. I just want to kind of emphasize that the era that we are in makes a huge difference in how generations are perceived. This used to be true with how millennials were perceived and written about maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and are still written about. And I think that will also continue as we go forward. So I'll just take a pause there.
Wow, that's already the first, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and super insightful here. As you spoke, I feel a little bit guilty too. I'm starting to become that older sort of person in the workplace that sometimes kind of probably misattributes certain things to generations. So let's dive in a little bit here. You mentioned how context is really important, and sometimes you misattribute things to generations, and you actually pointed out data as a really interesting, for example, example of things that drive different behaviors across generations. What do you think is the most interesting shift in factors or dynamics that you're observing in the intergenerational dynamics today versus when you published the book?
So I want to again take a step back and tell you about this, little anecdote that happened to me when I was writing the book, which is that one thing that struck me while I was writing and researching about generations was the reaction that I often received, which is that, oh, you're a millennial and you're also writing about millennials, and that's very interesting. So at first this seemed odd to me because in other areas of research, it's perfectly normative for someone to write about their own lived experiences, whether it's women uplifting other women or Black scholars or Asian scholars writing about race. But when it comes to generations, there's often this unspoken assumption that you need an external kind of a detached perspective, which I came away with saying that, hey, this demographic is probably treated a little differently as compared to some of the others. So that was just as an aside. So coming back to your question, I think on the research itself and what shifts have stayed. So I think there were about 7 lenses through which I explored the world of the millennials. And as I'm a millennial myself, it was also a lot of lived experiences that informed my writing and my research. Maybe I'll unpack one and see how that goes. So the first chapter of the book focused on motivation, right, which is the power of intrinsic drive. Motivation, as we all know, is universal, especially intrinsic motivation. Everybody seeks meaning and purpose. People are naturally drawn to work which is challenging and provides them intrinsic fulfillment. But from my research, I also found that millennials exhibited this especially strong drive for purpose and for meaningful work. And as I said, some of this could also be life stage related. Maybe younger employees tend to be more idealistic and may become more pragmatic over time. But there is also research to support this, recent research that says that today millennials seek a balance, right? It's no longer just about meaningful work, but rewards are also important. But this focus on intrinsic motivation, I think, has persisted into Gen Z as well. So like millennials, Gen Z today values personal growth, meaningful work, and opportunities for skill development. I'm sure you work with a ton of clients and you see this also, right? So there is also, in fact, data from the organization that I work in currently, which says that employees who engage in continuous learning tend to stay longer and perform better in their roles, which talks to that point about intrinsic motivation. If I'm motivated to learn, to perform, to grow, it's likely that I will stay back and perform better in the organization. So that one point about intrinsic motivation itself was a big eye-opener for me. Maybe, that trend continues today with Gen Z also seeking the same kind of meaning at work, purpose, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely resonates that, and it totally makes sense that your book started with a chapter on motivation, which I think is sort of the underlying force of all human behavior. I would be curious whether, there are different drivers of intrinsic motivation, right? There is competence, there is autonomy, there is feeling related to other people, and then you also mentioned purpose. I'd be very curious if different generations on average actually are gravitating towards different intrinsic motivators, or if that's just purely individual and it's not really at the societal level. I don't know if you have a perspective on that.
Sure. The intrinsic motivation theory, which talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, or relatedness, as you said. And there was this very strong dive, at least from the research that I did, towards autonomy, especially for folks who were looking at starting up, for example, right? So there was a strong need for autonomy, at least in India. In the last, I think, decade or so, we are probably the 3rd or the 4th largest startup ecosystem in the world today. That wasn't the case about 15 or 20 years back. So all of this has been in the last 15 years. So clearly there's a generational shift in the fact that younger folks, millennials, in the last decade or so have taken on the mantle of starting up, which means that you need to have a strong drive for autonomy for you to be able to say, hey, I'm going to risk not taking up a stable job and do some things on my own, which is now a part of the culture here, at least in this country, right? So it's not seen as taboo to start up or, become an entrepreneur, which was not the case about in my parents' generation, right? It was all about taking a government job, getting a secure lifestyle, and then, thinking about family. Today, of course, all those things also matter, but there's also this additional layer of what does this all mean and what is the end that we are going towards, right? So how am I contributing to society? How am I contributing to making a difference through my work?
Yeah.
And that also links back to the point of purpose, right? So why am I doing what am I doing, and do I have sufficient freedom to be able to contribute? So that's just my 2 cents on your comment.
Yeah, that really, that checks out from like the anecdotal or like my personal observations, right? What it seemed like for me is the younger generations have grown up. People call them like the TikTok generation, but it's not just TikTok. I think they just have more exposure to more role models that are relatable, that aren't just immediately in their local neighborhood. And usually the more global role models are like creators. They're like out there. They're actually like charting their own lives. And I do see a lot of people saying, hey, that's what I want to do. Whereas back in the day, the amount of people who have exposure to that kind of influencers who are also relatable was less so, right? They're either like Hollywood stars or something, and you don't really think, okay, like that's actually what I think I can do. But being an individual creator with a following who's just like another teenager professional feels far more attainable. And I think more people have taken that path. Similar with startups, I feel like there's just been a lot more, especially at the peak in the early 20s, just unicorns being generated like every week, like in the world. And I think startup was quite glorified at that time.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't think influencer as a profession even existed,
right?
But a couple of decades back, right? So somebody his full-time job is to create video content, for instance, on Instagram or YouTube or what have you. So,
yeah. I guess I have a question for you. So, obviously there's a group of people who are setting that as a career path. But in general, I do also think that there is sort of a common narrative that Gen Zs are much, to your point, seeking more autonomy. And even when they're inside a workplace, the way that they advocate for themselves and engage with their superiors or like people who are managing them is different. If you're seeing certain dynamics that are changing in the new workplace with the new generations versus millennials, and how companies that actually are managed that effectively are doing so.
So I think a couple of trends have persisted since the time that I started doing my research on the millennials, which is to your point about younger generations seeking more autonomy, seeking more purpose, and seeking more intrinsic motivation in general. I think that trend has persisted. So that shift, I would say, continue. And like you said, today also younger generations want those same things at work. What is also interesting to see is that when I was writing the book, I'm talking about 2014, right? Exactly 10 years ago. When I was doing my research, there wasn't as much talk about work-life balance or mental health, for instance, which is I think a lot more prominent today, and there's a lot more awareness about the fact that, hey, I don't want to be burnt out. I want meaning, but at the same time, I don't want to be in a job where I'm burnt out in 3 years and then I need to take a break for 6 months, right? So I think there's a lot more awareness of that, which is our generation, I think. Well, maybe not the entire generation, but some of us pushed it too far. And there are a lot of those examples also in the popular media of startups that went too far, for instance. And there are some learnings to be taken from there. And that's also permeated into the culture, which is to say that how do we strike the right balance between doing great work, getting paid for it, and at the same time, making sure that it's not just about work all the time. How can I take a step back and enjoy life in general? So I think that's also another trend from a shift perspective, since you were asking me that, which has come to the fore a lot more. And that's interestingly an area of research that I'm looking at currently, which is what does it mean for workplace culture? I think one shift that happened, like this Black Swan event that happened that affected all of us, I think, was COVID in 2020. And that, I think, also was a significant shift, which affected how, and Gen Z was just coming into the workplace, right? They were only a few years old into the workplace, and some of them were just finishing up college. So I think that was also a great shift that happened in the sense that it affects how workplace culture is looked at. In my current organization, for instance, we had to take permission to work from home pre-COVID. Now we need to take permission to come to the office.
Right.
Right. So that's how it is right now. So there's a complete 360-degree shift. And I think it matters a lot because when I was growing up, I remember I used to go to office. I would sit with my bosses, with my colleagues, senior professionals, and I'd get mentored on a day-to-day basis. And I would look forward to those conversations, right? I would get into client calls with people that I knew who would talk to me and debrief me and things like that. When you're working from home, it doesn't happen, especially for younger professionals. It's challenging. It's about striking the right balance. How do you make sure that the learning is also disseminated while at the same time people don't get burnt out, right? So hybrid, I'm sure, is the way to go, but then, you can't push in either direction. Otherwise, it becomes difficult either way.
Yeah. One of the things that you said actually also kind of makes me think about is I have this mental model that almost everything in life is basically a pendulum, and the system just moves a little bit in waves. Most things don't seem to have a very stable equilibrium. Most things seem to have a dynamic where it tilts a little bit here and too far, and then there's a reaction, and it goes the other way, and it gets too far, right? And so when you said about mental health and burnout and stuff, I definitely think there was a period where it was really overheated on one direction. And there's been a backlash around, well, what's the purpose of doing that? And going the other way. One way it could play out is it goes almost too far there. And then people are like, wait, I need to actually work hard to actually get ahead. And then there's a different pendulum swing at some point. But it seems like we're not at that part of the swing yet.
Yeah. And I think organizations that survive that pendulum swing are the ones who are agile enough to adapt with the swing so that they can make sense of what's going on and also make those shifts accordingly. But I'm totally with you on that.
I want to actually go into talking about impact of AI native people that will be coming into the workforce that actually have started in the sense that they started using AI in school and coming to workforce for the first time. But maybe before I go there, based on your research, I wonder if you've seen what are some of these contextual factors that most strongly determine behaviors of certain generations? Rise of data was an example of one factor that has really driven different behaviors. I'm curious if you've seen patterns there.
I think there are some universal factors which are true irrespective of where you stay in the world today, because the world is flat. And as you said, if I'm an influencer sitting, let's say in South Korea, where you're from, and there are lots of Indians, for instance, who follow Korean influencers, right? So technology, I think, is a big factor, which is technological advancements in the way that it is structured. And today, of course, it's all about AI. So there's a next shift that's already going on, and we are in it. Economic conditions are definitely one other factor which affect how millennials or any generation really perceives the world. I would also say access to opportunities. So it's not just about AI, data, or technology. I think a lot of technology today through channels like social media, for instance, also gives people access to opportunities, which was not the case before. So I sit out of Bangalore in India, and I take care of learning for a large organization which is headquartered in the US. And I don't need to travel at all, right? I can do this remotely, sitting out of home very comfortably. So those shifts, I think, are remarkable in the way that they've transformed work and the workplace, and we are right in the middle of it. So I would say technology, access to opportunities, economic conditions, and also societal norms to a large extent. What is acceptable, what's not acceptable. Today, it's very acceptable for, as I was saying, for people to start up here, which is probably not always the case for my parents' generation, right? So these are some of the big factors in my mind, at least, that predict what a generation might do or might not do, kind of leading indicators of what could happen in the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. I suspect back in the day, and hopefully this will not be such a dominant factor in our lifetime, but back in the day, I think wars, I'm sure, really just shaped our lives so much. In general, maybe conceptually, I also think about the level of struggle that a generation needs to endure, or the generation grows up watching their parents endure, how that shapes their perception of effort versus reward and long-term versus short-term gratification, and actually really change the calculus around when do I put in effort for what. Anyways, very, very interesting. Okay, so we can't escape AI, obviously, and there's so much questions and curiosities and concerns about how is AI going to change the workplace. I think there's also an interesting question of how does it change incentives and motivations of the people who are coming in and behaviors of how they sort of get adjusted to the workplace from school. We just obviously started to bring new grads into the workplace that are much more AI forward. But I'm curious if you started to notice certain emerging behaviors that hint at what is the change in dynamic that's going to happen with this new AI generation.
It's fascinating. I can already see, stark differences in the way that new graduates, for instance, work. So as an example, I was a fly on the wall in one of those training programs that we typically do for management trainees who come to us from colleges. And I was just listening. I didn't really participate in that call. So I heard them talk about how they use generative AI in writing their final year thesis. And I remember, I don't know about you, but it took me months to work and get through my thesis, multiple revisions.
Yeah.
But these folks accomplished it in weeks with the power of Gen AI. And there's also one guy who remarked that how he used Quillbot for plagiarism checks, right, prior to submitting his thesis. Now, you can listen to such things and be appalled, saying, oh my God, what is this? This Gen Z cuts corners. They're not serious about their work. AI is destroying our way of working. Or I think you can also be a little curious and look for deeper insights into how our world is transforming or shaping for the better based on how AI and tools around AI, which are being effectively used by this next generation. So if you can reframe that a little bit and think about the fact that Gen Z is not just using AI as a shortcut, but as a powerful enabler for efficiency, for creativity, for problem solving. It's not just seen as a threat, but as a natural extension of the thinking process, of the cognitive process. So it really helps us, all of us, work smarter and focus on higher order thinking. I remember a professor in my college used to say, hey, Subbu, you need to get to higher order thinking for you to be able to solve the big challenges in the world. So if AI is allowing me to do that, it's giving me more time and it's allowing me to be more productive, I can actually focus on the questions that really matter at the end of the day. Some of these trends are, it's still early days, of course. It's just been a couple of years since ChatGPT was launched. So this story is evolving, I'm sure. But there are some clear trends or markers in how Gen Z utilizes Gen AI. So there is focus on speed and efficiency, getting things done well. This focus on AI first problem solving. You always have a Copilot open at any given point in time. Focus on critical thinking, for instance, and not just being passively utilizing the tool, right? So the fact that somebody used Quillbot for plagiarism checks shows also that they are aware of ethical boundaries, not just blindly using AI for doing their work, but also questioning, validating, refining their work. And I think the last point I'd probably make here is that it's also about augmentation. It's not just about replacement. So it's enhancing the creativity of people vis-a-vis just replacing it with an AI. These are some of the early shifts that I have observed. I don't know about you, but this is what I have seen.
Yeah, I am both very excited and we have questions, obviously, like everyone does today. I think the number one thing that I wonder about is the dominant behavior going to be people using AI to really elevate their thinking or delegate their thinking away? And it's not super clear to me what is the average behavior going to be. And I think of course, there are like people always on the margin, right? There are always going to be people who actually use it for effective thinking. There are going to be people who sort of just literally use it to generate outputs and just send it to their managers. Yeah. But I think it's actually more like on average, what's the behavior? Because that's actually what's much more, I think, critical. And that I'm not sure. Let's say like in the pessimistic scenario where most people are just so used to just creating very fast outputs without putting in any effort and sort of like sending it, which means they don't build a muscle to judge an output for critical mistakes or like elevating quality. And if you just don't build that muscle, how do you ever generate leaders who will have to make decisions in novel situations where you actually have to connect the dots that are relatively new and sort of decide for yourself, no, that's not good enough. Like, yes, like this is what we have to go. And I can see like argument both ways, but I think that's one of the core questions of how this shapes like people's behaviors in the workplace. Maybe secondarily, I do actually also wonder whether it will have any impact on how we consider like work ethic and what effective work looks like. There, I don't really have a perspective other than like I could totally imagine it does change the equation a little bit for people.
And I think to your point, your first point about how do you really judge good work and good
Mm.
output without it just being a quick thing, so I think that's probably where the role of the manager becomes important, is what I think. Where today I know for a fact that if I give a task to my team, I know for a fact that they're going to use tools and they're going to come back to me. But then the cycle of review and iteration also makes it refined. The output gets more refined. And therefore, my job as the manager of that team is essentially not to tell my people what to do, but really look at the output that they generate and look at it through the lens of, hey, are my stakeholders going to be happy with whatever has been generated here? Is my client going to be happy with this? Because that's the experience that I bring as a manager or a leader. Therefore, my role has also changed. It's no longer just about creating that fancy deck and going and presenting it to the client, but I can actually give some higher order work to my team as well for them to really have fun with it. And then they come back and they learn in the process.
I fully agree with that. I feel like there's like even more importance of managers upholding really high standards that go above and beyond stuff that just gets generically produced and help people learn like what excellence actually looks like, so that they can discern what is mediocre, good, great, or excellent outputs, especially if output creation takes seconds.
Yeah.
Then like your value add is actually ability to look at it and say, no, this is not good enough, or yes, this is quite distinctive and this is what's going to get people to really want to listen to me. Maybe let's shift towards what organizations can do. I wanted to ask you about, in your research and in your experience, what differentiates organizations that really manage and harness intergenerational diversity versus ones that struggle to do?
Sure. Organizations that are not averse of putting together people in a room who come from different generations, where they can have open conversations respectfully, meaningfully, without really pulling each other down. It doesn't happen. You may think that organizations of all shapes and sizes are doing this, but they're not, because you have this inherent in group bias where you want to be people who are similar to you, who are as old as you, who are we all have that natural tendency, right? So we gravitate towards that. But leaders and managers who see that and who say that, hey, to be able to harness this diversity, I need people in the room who are diverse and working with each other, and who really push people to collaborate in that fashion and not just say that, hey, all my millennials are going to be working on this project versus Gen Z. So instead of them looking at it as a homogeneous pool of individuals working in silos versus really ensuring that people are coming together and adding value. Sometimes it happens naturally because you gravitate towards people because of your personality or what have you, right? You might go to our group and you're more curious and therefore you want to learn. But that's really dependent on individuals. That's not really off design. But then if you're doing this systematically as a manager, where you are encouraging, for instance, reverse mentoring, right? Where you're saying that these youngsters who just joined us from college have a ton to teach us. Let's get into a room and ask them what's the latest, right? That's going on. That, I think, signals a lot of humbleness and curiosity in the minds of leaders to be able to listen to people who have just come into the workforce, which I don't think happens a lot. As I was saying, I was a fly in the wall, so I got to learn a couple of things in that call. Yeah. But had I done that consciously, I'm pretty sure I would have learned 10 other things. So it's that ability of me to push, really to go and listen to what these folks are saying who are from a different generation than I am. And what are those life experiences vis-a-vis saying, hey, I'm the boss, I know everything, and you need to listen to me. So consciously really having those conversations where people talk to each other, listen to each other, and work with each other and bring in different varied skill sets and do it very consciously. I think that's what differentiates organizations who can really harness the potential of multiple generations versus those who can't.
That's really interesting. So it seems like first they acknowledge the existence of the multi-generations. It's not like a thing that kind of sits in the background, but it is actually, they just actually bring it to surface and almost frame it as a strength of the organization, where there's now opportunity for it learning to happen across and really facilitate that perspective sharing to happen.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. One thing that I think often I hear leaders say, in private settings, is different people have different preconceptions, not just leaders, actually, young generations. They have preconceptions of people who are in other generations. And there are a lot of complaints about each other. Some of them probably valid, others maybe grounded in stereotypes. When you have a certain perception, it's hard for people to fully engage and really embrace the learning, right? I'm curious if these organizations that do it really well take certain steps to overcome these initial perceptions that may be hindering good interactions?
I wouldn't say organizations, I would probably say leaders that I have worked with. This is just my experience, right? So I have seen leaders who have been very curious and who have gone through this initial barrier that you're talking about, which is this, talk that, hey, Gen Z is lazy and they're entitled, right? And millennials are job hoppers or what have you. So once they get past this initial roadblock of, what I think they are versus starting to see people for who they are versus categorizing them and labeling them. I think that block is not easy to get out of. In my experience, what I have done is that I have run workshops in organizations back when I was a consultant, where it was mandatory for people from different generations to come and sit together in a room. And because it's a facilitated conversation, you get to lay down the rules. So rule number one is make sure that people are respectful of each other. Rule number two is that make sure that you're really listening, right? It doesn't matter if you're a leader or a first-time manager or a college graduate, but you're really listening. And then three, facilitate the conversation based on these couple of rules. And it could be any topic. Usually it's about things like feedback. It's about things like how do we make this a better place to work? A focus group discussion after an employee engagement survey has been run. It's important to make sure that you cut across those demographics and make sure that people are coming together in a room, but then lay down certain rules so that you can facilitate that conversation. And I think when that happens, when you really break those imaginary walls and ask them to have a discussion, then somewhere that light bulb goes off right at the back of your mind saying that, hey, I thought that these Gen Zs are only about AI, but then they seem to be wiser than I was when I was their age. Those kind of insights start to emerge. Or, youngsters say that I thought I knew everything about Gen AI, but then I learned a cool new tool today from somebody who's 20 years my senior because he has been working with clients that I haven't had an opportunity to work with. So some of these, stereotypes start to break down really, and that also comes from contact theory, right? So people that wouldn't necessarily come sit together in a room and have a conversation, you're forcing that through these facilitated conversations. It's an intervention. If you're really serious about doing that, it can be done in a very controlled setting with an outcome in mind, improving employee engagement or employee experience or leadership development, feedback, what have you, right? So if you do that, then it becomes interesting for everybody, right? And you slowly chip away at the culture which used to be siloed, and you start bringing together heterogeneous groups who come and start talking to each other. So that's something that I have tried back in my days when I was a consultant, which really worked well. I had fun as a facilitator and people also had fun. It wasn't always easy. There were difficult conversations and you had to break through some of these stereotypes. It would take hours to do it. Not everybody was also on board at the end of it. People still went back thinking, grumbling, why was I in this room? But there was a good percentage of people who also benefited from it. Yeah.
I could totally see how great leaders are really the agents for driving the right behaviors through both role modeling and also creating the space and motivating the right sort of interactions and conversations. And you mentioned curiosity as being a really big one. Are there other qualities of leaders who are very effective at leading intergenerational teams?
I think those who take themselves out of the equation, they do really well. Very easy for me to say that. You need to take yourself out of the equation. You're a CEO of a startup yourself. You know how difficult it is to do that. But then the moment that you do, even if it is for 5 minutes or 10 minutes in a very critical meeting, you're fully present with the group. Maybe you can call it awareness, which is the presence that you have. And as a result of that awareness, you're able to pull yourself out maybe for a brief period of time so you can really deeply listen to what people are saying. And then, of course, you need to move the conversation forward. So maybe if you're a leader, you will probably do that eventually. But then to be able to toggle between that switch of, hey, I need to be assertive now so that we get things done, but now is a good time for me to listen. And how am I creating that safe space for people to really say what they want to say? That's the other big thing. You may be listening, but then nobody's really saying anything. So that's not helping. Which also means that how are you projecting yourself as a leader? Are you projecting yourself as somebody who gets things done, very aggressive, or are you also somebody who's assertive while at the same time you also listen and you make space for others to also contribute? So I think striking that right balance, if that makes sense, really helps so that you can push and pull these different levers based on the situation that you're in. And it comes out of a place of authenticity. It's not because you want to get some outcome, or you genuinely want to listen and you genuinely want to drive that curiosity for yourself and for the team. And you're kind of role modeling certain behaviors which then become the norm. The people see you doing that and they know what to do going forward. They're not always just pushing things through. They're also taking a step back because they've seen you do that, and they kind of hold themselves accountable to that as well. So these are unstated norms that really help build team cultures, is what I'm seeing.
That's really insightful. What it reminds me of is, I don't know if you're familiar with adaptive leadership as a concept, but one of the key tenets of it is that you need to be able to go onto the balcony, which is kind of taking yourself out of the equation and actually really observe. And I think the reason why is that in like what they call adaptive challenge, which is a very complex challenge with like lots of different things where solutions are not obvious and things like that, you actually do have to really observe the dynamics. And there's the obvious things that are first order actions being taken, and there are underlying things, and you actually have to tease those things out to be able to solve that problem. I could totally imagine, based on the conversation you and I had, intergenerational dynamics are one of those things where you might observe some things and actually attribute what's going on to XYZ factors. And it's very easy to misattribute. That's literally how you started the conversation, which is context matters, but also like you have to be careful and like figuring out what is driving what. And your ability to like step back and actually observe, okay, what's actually going on here, and tease out what is actually an intergenerational thing, what is a personality conflict, what are people just maybe mistaken about, and then be able to direct the conversation and the interaction through combination of asserting and listening seems really important for the leader to navigate that.
And also knowing that you may not have all the answers all the time.
Right.
I think that admitting that, I think, is also difficult for leaders to do. So if so long as you can do that in a way that you're seen as somebody who's professionally attributing the fact that I need this input from you, people help you out for it, and vice versa. Right? They come to you when they need it. As you said, there are these underlying factors which are not always there. So it's synthesis. It's not just analysis. Some of these ideas bubble up as a result of this space that you create.
Conversely, what's one big mistake you tend to see leaders make when they try to bridge intergenerational divides?
Well, lots of mistakes I'm also learning. I think what happens is the first point, which is what we started with, right, which is the misattribution, I think is a big one. And it's normal. It's not something that, because we are wired to very quickly problem solve and get to the bottom of things, I think we tend to misattribute more often than we realize, and also the fact that we are biased in more ways than one. That's a big one. We tend to rely on these rules of thumb and stereotypes rather than seeing people for who they are. That's something to be careful about. And we've already spoken about it, right? Gen Z is entitled, millennials need constant praise, Gen X is resistant, we never seem to get anything done in this organization. So these things persist. I think what's important is that we need to stop reducing employees or people to these labels and really figure out what's causing this miscommunication, where is it coming from, where really is the disengagement coming from. I think that's a better approach.
Last question for you, like 2 to 3 predictions you have and what's going to really shift in intergenerational dynamics over the next 5 years, and why do you think that?
As we were also discussing earlier, there's some trends which have seemed to have stuck over the last generation since our generation came into the workplace. I think those will continue. The fact that millennials were digital natives, my generation were digital natives, the first generation where digital was really the order of the day. Every generation that follows, starting with the Gen Z that's already here right now, and Gen Alpha, I think will continue to embrace technology. And I already feel it easier to work with the younger generation now because of that, possibly because the fact that they augment my ways of working very well. That, I think, is an evolving concept, and it will continue. I also feel that in the age of machines and AI and algorithms, humans will tend to matter more. So your soft skills, the power skills of creativity, collaboration, communication, I think those will really, really become important. Because if it's really you generating output and your other stakeholder also evaluating that output, and both of you using algorithms to do that, the human factor really becomes critical, right? I think that's a very natural outcome of all that's happening now. And the third piece I would probably say is that the well-being part that I was telling you earlier, which is health and well-being, I think will become a universal priority, because the fact that with AI already we can see rise in productivity. And what is happening is that you tend to save at least an hour a day if you use AI and generative AI really well. There is data to show that at least an hour a day. And I think that's conservative. I'm sure you can save many hours a day if you really work smart using technology that's available to you today. So the question is, therefore, who really benefits from all these extra hours that are saved? Organizations that give back the saved time to employees, I think, will build a more sustainable, engaged workforce. And those that simply demand more output without really considering well-being will risk burnout. They won't get the best talent, and there will be disengagement as a result. So I think it's not just about efficiency anymore. It's about how organizations choose to use that efficiency to create a better working experience for their people.
Super, this was a really fascinating conversation and a topic that I haven't, dove into before. So thanks so much for joining, and I'm really looking forward to just building relationships with you and learning more from you going forward.
Same here, Vince. A fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for all of those insightful questions. Also got me thinking about a lot of things that I tend to don't generally put down in the way that I kind of thought about and spoke about with you. So thank you for those questions, and thanks for having me.